All right, this video is dealing with Module 33 and inflation. So the first thing is that we have to talk about the classical model of price level. And the classical model was introduced in Module 33, and it basically is talking about how it ignores the short run changes and we're just focusing on the long run. So what this means is that I'll bring up this graph here that we've been using to look at long run effects. Basically what we're talking about is that in the long run, remember that the money changes in the money supply, and this would be an example of when the money supply is increased. In the long run, the price level is eventually increased from E1 to E3. But the classical model ignores E2. What they basically are looking at with the classical model is that they are making the assumption that our short-run aggregate supply curve moves basically at the same time that our aggregate demand curve moves. And classical economists basically view this as that the nominal wages are not sticky in the short run. They say that nominal wages happen like that and they change like that. And so it's just an automatic. And they view this E1 to E3, and there is no E2. Okay? This theory and this viewpoint works well when there's high inflation, because when there's high inflation, people expect that high amount of inflation and they will build that into their expectations and they will build that into their contracts automatically. However, when inflation is low, okay, it's not as big of a deal, and so people don't necessarily, it takes a while for that short run aggregate supply curve to move. But when there's high inflation, people are expecting that high inflation, and it's going to take a lot less time to move the short run aggregate supply curve. So keep in mind, this is that classical viewpoint of macroeconomics. Okay, so that's the classical viewpoint. Now we have to talk about types of inflation. So there are basically three types of inflation that we need to talk about. The first type of inflation is what we call hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is this crazy amount of inflation, and we're talking triple digits at least, that is caused by this idea of an inflation tax. So the inflation tax is comes from the idea that the federal government can print money. Because the federal government can print money, they actually make revenue, they actually make money off from printing money, okay? Because they are actually going to be going and collecting, it's kind of think of it as the olden days where, you know, they actually had to, pound out silver and gold, and they had to charge people to be able to do that. Well, kind of the same thing now is that the federal government basically gets a kickback from being able to print this money. But here's the thing is that when they print more money, and so for example the money supply shifts to the right, okay, it will eventually cause inflation, which we just saw, okay? So it's basically because they can print more money, you have what they call an inflation tax. And basically what the inflation tax is it's this idea that because of inflation, the value of your money has dropped. And the value of your money has dropped because they printed more to cover this budget deficit. And when you get into hyperinflation, it gets this vast, vicious cycle where what happens is that inflation has happened and people start using the money less. And people don't use the money as less. Well, the government can't have that because then they won't get their revenue from printing money. So what happens is they say, okay, well, we were collecting X amount of dollars when you were using it, but now you're not using it. So we need to print more money to be able to collect that same amount of revenue. So we're going to print more money. And so then people use it less. And so then we need to print more money to cover the difference, the revenue that we're lost because you're not using it. And so we're going to print more money. And it's just this vicious cycle. And that's what happens with hyperinflation. Good examples of this, obviously, Germany right after World War I, the Deutschmark got ridiculously low value, and to the point of some people actually said that they were wallpapering their walls with Deutschmarks. More recent example, Zimbabwe. So I have a very short video clip for you.
Back into the market.
Is my portfolio looking
Not
good?
this one.
Good question.
Is my portfolio on track with my long-term financial plan?
Better question. At Charles Schwab, we help you ask better questions about how your wealth is managed.
175 quadrillion Zimbabwean dollars, worth just 5 US ones. That's the going exchange rate for the now officially defunct currency. Hyperinflation ravaged the local dollar until it hit 500 billion% in 2008. The government was forced to allow the use of foreign currencies like the US dollar. Christopher Magaga is CEO of Zimbabwe's Chamber of Commerce.
A lot of people were quite very aggrieved as they felt they'd lost a lot of money after we had converted in February of 2009 into US dollar terms. So, as a Chamber of Commerce, we believe this could be a right move for the government in trying to restore sanity.
15 years ago, the economy was plunged into crisis when Robert Mugabe's government started a campaign of violent seizures of white-owned commercial farms. They were distributed to black subsistence growers, and as a result, exports of tobacco and other crops were slashed. The economy shrank, creating a recession that lasted until 2009. So can Zimbabwe return to its financial glory days anytime soon? Peter Dixon of Commerce Bank says no.
It's a kleptocracy. It has been allowed to fall apart. It has been mismanaged, and foreign investors have pulled out. Until such times you see a significant reform of the economy, of the government process, which will attract foreign investors back into the market. I'm afraid Zimbabwe, far from being the breadbasket of Africa, is likely to remain a basket case.
Zimbabweans have until September to trade in any old currency if they can carry the notes to the bank, but they might be better off auctioning them on eBay. A 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note is fetching bids of 35 US dollars, far more than the 40 cents on offer at the central bank.
All right, so the point of the video is that, yes, there were actual trillionaires in Zimbabwe. This was $100 trillion, the picture that I found. And yes, they actually are selling them on eBay. Yeah, you can actually go and look for them. I did look and see if I could buy one, but it was costing more than I was willing to spend on an example for this particular unit. So the interesting thing, though, is that obviously in the Zimbabwe's case is that they actually had lots of people that were actually using U.S. currency instead. What the video was showing you is that they actually were changing their currency, and so they were dropping off many, many, many zeros. And so what happened was that they can actually trade in that $100 trillion banknote, and it may be worth, like, for example, $10. 10 new dollars, right? So keep in mind that hyperinflation, obviously very crazy, and it just gets way out of control. Another type of inflation, cost-pushed inflation. This is caused by a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Sorry, this should be S. Short-run aggregate supply curve. Basically what we have happening, if you remember it from our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply model, is that we're shifting our short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. What causes that shift? Well, it could be a couple of things. We could have our nominal wages are going to increase. We could have our commodity prices increase. Or we could have just a general decrease in productivity. But this is called cost push because it's generally a result of either the cost of wages or the cost of commodities pushing prices up for everything else. So that's cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation, on the other hand, is caused by the increase in aggregate demand. So rather than the short-run aggregate supply curve moving, now we're increasing our aggregate demand curve. We're moving it to the right. So this could be caused by, for example, the government spending more, or less taxes, or the interest rates go down, or expectations about future investments increasing, or just generally people having more money. Either way, it's also going to cause inflation. Okay, so demand pull will pull pull prices up based off from demand. Cost push is going to push prices up based off from the short run aggregate supply. All right, that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions.